Hello, and welcome to the October meeting of CHOW. And not only is this the October meeting, this is the 94th birthday of our founder, Shirley Cherkasky. And Shirley, I was told, is going to be on the call. Not sure. But if we could just take a real quick minute and people can hold their hands up in front of your face and give her a clap for 94 years and thanking her for all the work she's done for CHOW in the past. We wouldn't be here without her. So this is very special that we have a meeting on her birthday. Today, Margie Gibson, the CHOW Line editor, will have the privilege of introducing our speaker. Judy Mazza, our vice president, who usually does that, unfortunately is unavailable to be at the meeting today. But we're in very capable hands with Margie doing the introduction. And for questions to Ursula, we're going to ask you to please save them to the end of the meeting, jot them down if you need to in the moment so you don't forget later. That's what I do. But at the end of the meeting, then start putting them in chat, and Ursula will respond to your questions after the meeting, reading them through chat. So Margie, and we will have, after the meeting as usual, any whatsits and any other announcements for the general CHOW membership will come after Ursula's presentation is complete. Okay, Margie, thank you.
Thank you, Pam. I'm happy to be here today and do this introduction. Ursula Heinzelmann is an independent scholar and a culinary historian born and raised in Berlin. She wears a dizzying array of hats. She trained as a chef and a sommelier and now works as a freelance wine and food writer. Beside Beyond Bratwurst, the book on which her lecture today is based, she has written 6 books on food, cooking, and cheese. She also writes for Saveur and the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. She was an area editor for the Oxford Companion to Cheese, as well as the Oxford Companion to Sugar and Sweets. Ursula is also the trustee director of the Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery and the curator of the Cheese Berlin Festival. Which brings me to her other homes, the places where she feels particularly comfortable. I first encountered her at the Oxford Food Symposium in 2006, when she won the much prized Sophie Coe Award for her article, Teltoft Turnips, Humble Roots with a Long History, a unique example of the link between place of origin and authenticity of flavor. Ursula is now one of the most recognized faces of the symposium and also hosts its Kitchen Table series. This is a monthly session that grew out of the first virtual symposium in 2020. Monthly Zoom discussions on timely topics relating to food carry the symposium experience throughout the year. Her other home is Markthalle 9 in the Kreuzberg district of Berlin. If you are ever in Berlin, this is a must-see. Markthalle 9 is a refurbished market hall. It has developed into a crossroads for small food producers, as well as an incubator for small food businesses. It's an effort to counter the dominance of discount grocers and provide an alternative in regional, thoughtfully produced food choices. Markthalle 9 gives Ursula a platform for educating people about her favorite topic, cheese. She gives monthly talks and also organizes larger festivals, such as Cheese Berlin, focusing on the diversity of cheeses. And with that, I am delighted to turn this over to Ursula.
Thank you, Margie. That was a very generous introduction.
Thank you.
And I feel a bit of pressure now, of expectations, which hopefully I will fulfill. Just adding one thing to your introduction, that I'm not hosting the OFS kitchen table on my own, not at all. It's quite a joint effort, and my main collaborator, David Matchett, is also in the room. Without him, it would certainly not be happening. So thank you for that invitation. It's an honor to address you. I'm getting a bit of feedback. Perhaps somebody needs to shut down their microphone. I certainly can't shut down mine, I'm sorry. Patrick, perhaps? Okay, let's see. So the title of my talk today is what does German mean on the plate and the cheese board? Food in Germany is a combination that makes most people think of beer and sausage, pretzels, and Limburger cheese. However, the 82 million inhabitants of contemporary Germany do not all exclusively live on Oktoberfest fare. Instead of being uniform, German food has always been extremely complex. The regional variations of today are based as much on political, cultural, and socioeconomic factors as on geography. As you know, Germany is a country in the middle of the European continent, situated between the Slavs and the Romans, cold and heat, sea and mountains. In the course of history, it has seen an enormous number of influences from all sides. To understand those is to understand the reasons for how and what people in Germany eat today. The openness and receptiveness Germans have shown, at least in general, mark them right up to the present day. Instead of clinging desperately to something static, to be preserved by all means like an haute cuisine cut in stone, new layers have again and again been added from all sides, leading to frequent rejuvenation and a food culture with a remarkable flexibility. Likewise, Germany's decentralized political structure, so often quoted as being to its disadvantage, actually promoted this receptiveness and plurality. How far can one trace German foodways back in time? One of the first written records comes from the Roman historian Tacitus in the 1st century AD. In his Germania, he described the food habits of the wild German tribes. According to him, they survived on wild fruits, game meat that was fresh and had not been hung, a serious sign of lack of civilization from a Roman point of view, and lac concretum, curdled milk or quark. Tacitus also mentioned a beverage made from fermented barley or other grain he described as being wine-like. Although he seems to have been partly interested in showing his effeminate, degenerate compatriots an unspoiled, naturally strong people, and his description therefore must be taken with a pinch of salt, it is striking that beer, meat, and cheese, 3 of the usual Oktoberfest suspects, were already big favorites nearly 2,000 years ago. Before we now focus on that lac concretum, that is cheese, and explore a bit further why the German artisan cheese scene is not a revival because there isn't anything to revive, here's another thought to ponder on when discussing Germanness on the plate. And that is the enormous importance of self-perception in how one is seen by others. Let me explain. The English version of Beyond Bratwurst, my little baby, was all fresh from the printers when I did a lecture tour on the East Coast in spring 2014. One stop was Ithaca College in New York State. I was hosted by the German department, and we had announced a lecture on German food history, focusing on the example of cheese, on an afternoon with plenty of other activities offered on campus for the students. 25 participants would be really good, I was told. We had 50. They sat on the floor, they shared the tasting plates, And most important, they hadn't come for the free cheese, but listened intently. They really wanted to know why cheese traditions in Germany and the US differed so much from those of France, and why Germany was still predominantly associated with Oktoberfest. Because for those young Americans, there was no doubt about the fact that we Germans didn't feed exclusively on Haxen, pretzels, and beer. When they heard that for the generation of their parents during my very first trip to the US in the early 80s, mentioning Berlin always inevitably led to the stereotypes of sauerkraut, the Berlin Wall, and Adolf Hitler, they were shocked. It made them realize how much has changed. Today, traveling as a Berliner is a very different experience. Where are you from? Berlin. Cool. Sure, currywurst isn't exactly the stuff to tell the Michelin-starred world about, but there's so much else, not the least very good sauerkraut and wonderful cheese. However, what has changed, and changed fundamentally, is German self-perception. German history, as everybody else's, can't be changed. But our own understanding of it, facing up to it, that is something you can work on. And that extends to cooking, eating, and drinking as much as to everything else. So before we get to our cheese, let me drive home again my point on the receptiveness of German foodways over the centuries and millennia. A 2007 survey, and I wish I had a new one, I have to look for one, but they were not done that often. So a survey from 2007 asking 14 to 60 years old about their favorite dishes produced the following list in decreasing order. Starts with spaghetti bolognese, spaghetti with tomato sauce, schnitzel, pizza, rouladen, that is beef roulades, asparagus, sauerbraten, lasagna, steak, Nudelauflauf, that is a pasta casserole, very much in the style of macaroni and cheese, kohlrouladen, which are braised cabbage roulades with a mincemeat stuffing, fish, Kasslerbraten, that is brined and smoked pork roast, spinach, Königsberger Klopse, that is meatballs in a white sauce flavored with lemon, capers, and herring or anchovies, and Grünkohl, curly kale with meat and potatoes. Which shows how German food today reflects the manifold influences accumulated through history. It is a remarkable mix of regional and global, homely and more elegant dishes, traditional and more modern ones, with vegetables and meat almost evenly represented. The long-standing culinary connection with Italy is as obvious as the heritage of French influence. Sweet and sour sauerbraten represents medieval times. The old love of pork persists, but American steak has also become a regular on German plates, reflecting the post-Second World War Americanism of West Germany. All the religious rules are reflected in vegetables and fish. Kasslerbraten reminds us not only of Celtic salt pork, but also more recent East German preferences. Not on the list, because they are regarded as dessert rather than main courses, are the contemporary forms of the Neolithic rule with which I start time traveling in my book. Milchreis, rice pudding, and Grießpudding, semolina pudding, are German comfort foods, and they spell out childhood memories to most of us. But they also go back much further and connect us to the earliest layers of our culinary fabric. The remarkable thing is that no single period seems to stand out in particular. At least seen from the culinary point of view, Germans have indeed achieved a notable balance. One could even perhaps say serenity. Furthermore, If we had similar lists for individual regions of Germany, another important characteristic of German foodways would emerge even more clearly. There is no such thing as a national dish or cuisine in Germany. The openness to all kinds of influences, combined with the prevailing decentralized political and economic structures, has led to great diversity. Germans love their sausages, but there are any number of different kinds from different regions after which they continue to be named. The general knowledge about this diversity today on the one hand reinforces curiosity and receptivity, but on the other makes people even more aware of specifically regional food choices. And with that, on to our fromage. Back in those early 80s, when confronted with sauerkraut, which I used to hate, but now love, and Adolf Hitler, I often felt so tired of all that awkwardness. Why couldn't I just be from a nice, normal country with lovely, delicious cheeses, such as France? As you know, my grandparents and parents' generations after the war tried really hard to avoid their Germanness by drinking rosé from Provence and eating coq au vin, or falling for pizza, Chianti, and mozzarella. But Germany does not border the Mediterranean, and our most traditional cheese is neither Roquefort nor Pecorino, but Handkäse. Handkäse, you might wonder, of those who have a bit of a knowledge about German foodways, isn't that the rubbery, smelly stuff, also called Harzer or Korbkäse or Quagel? It is indeed. Fact is, once upon a time, but not that long ago, the cheese landscape of Germany could almost be called barren. It had only three main landmarks: highly aromatic, semi-hard, block-shaped Tilsiter on the Baltic coast, Bergkäse, the Alpine mountain hard cheese in the south, and in between, Handkäse, the very simple, small, hand-shaped cheeses made from sour skimmed milk left over from butter production. But since the late 1990s, things have been changing. New valleys and mountains, hillsides and meadows are being grazed upon, and a new generation of dairy farmers are turning their animals' milk into delicious beauties for the cheese board, somewhat comparable to what's been happening in the US. So an artisan cheese movement has increasingly found its feet. I've always liked cheese. I've been socialized, in fact, with Handkäse, which my mother used to put on the radiator to make it ripen and run away faster. Something she denies today, but I'm convinced of having seen and smelled. In my professional life as a chef, sommelier, wine merchant, cheesemonger, and finally and presently, since 20 years, wine and food writer, as well as food historian, cheese somehow slowly rose to the top of my priorities. Mind you, there's still wine. Today, I find real cheese at least as intriguing, captivating, and culturally revealing as wine is usually thought of. And I have to thank Rob Kaufeld, a New York cheesemonger, for that. I mean, he had no idea. It all goes back to the days following 9/11. My launch into freelance writing was still felt very new and courageous, and I was out searching for stories. Someone had told me about a cheesemaker from Israel and a cheese conference run by the Italian slow food movement in Piedmont in northern Italy. Clenching my teeth about travel costs, I booked a place and studied the program of lectures and tastings on offer. To cut it short, half of Italy went on strike that very weekend. I missed the Israeli cheesemaker and ended up at a tasting of American goat and ewe's milk cheeses. Keep in mind that this is 20 years ago. And American cheese then was about as unsexy here in Europe as German cheese brie was over there. I thought it was a joke, and perhaps a joke would also make a good story, to be totally honest. So I went to that tasting in default mode, thinking of it, as I said, as a kind of joke. And I brought all the arrogance of my education at the French school in Berlin to the table. And then it happened. Rob Kaufeld not only turned out to be a funny, knowledgeable, and inspiring presenter, the 6 cheeses he had brought almost knocked me off my chair because they were so good and original and beautiful. When the tasting was finished, I went up to Rob and apologized, explaining about my prejudices. And he immediately said, no need to. Our cheese used to look like plastic, it tasted like plastic, and it was wrapped in plastic. But slowly we are seeing more and more small farms turning their milk into real cheese. I felt exhilarated, almost high, as is often the case when serendipity makes me discover something exciting and completely unexpected and wonderful. I decided there and then that the next time my wine travels would take me to North America, I would visit as many of those cheesemakers as possible. In 2003, I finally went. Back then, cheesemakers were much less prepared for receiving visitors. There was virtually no signposting, and GPS was still in the future. In some, it was quite an adventure, and some of those very friendly cheese folks must have thought of me as not a little crazy. But I came home enriched and aware of the fact that I was witnessing an important, fast-growing movement. And then, while writing about it for a German Sunday newspaper, the next penny dropped with a massive pang. Something pretty similar was happening right in front of my doorstep in my own country, which proves once again that you only see that what you're already aware of and expect to see. All over Germany, artisan cheeses were springing up. Cheese fairs were held as dairy farms opened cheese rooms instead of having their white stuff collected every morning by the milk truck. And I started to research and travel and visit and taste and finally convince my publisher that there was a book that needed to be written. Some of you might by now be wondering what all the fuss is about. Isn't cheese just cheese to shave over your salad, let melt on your hamburger, have in a sandwich? And isn't large-scale production a good thing? Making sure it's available and affordable for everybody and safe and reliable? Well, yes. And this is the moment where I wish we could be in the actual same room together and actually taste. But let's imagine sliced cheese on the one hand and a beautiful piece of Alpine cheese on the other. One is almost neutral, always the same. If compared to a human life, totally predictable, getting up in the morning and following every single day the same schedule with the same tasks, the same people, same. The other makes you sit up, think, feeling good or bad, and it will be a little different every single time, just as different vintages of the same wine or apples from the same tree. One provides calories and fat and protein in a completely predictable way, controlled by technicians and engineers, and has a somewhat salty umami taste. The other nourishes our body too, but in addition, stimulates our senses and with that, our brain. Whereas the first one could be and is made wherever technical efficiency happens to meet up with large-scale dairy farming, the other is an expression of a landscape, of the people who live in it, of their way to make a living off it. Both have their place in the market, which I think of as a pyramid, but it is important to keep in mind that the bottom can't exist without the top. And I have to say here that my father is an engineer, so it's not engineer dissing, okay? Far be it from me. As I said earlier on, both North America and Germany have little tradition for this kind of expression and individuality in form of cheese. Whereas, for instance, in France, all those regional specialities developed which survive to this day, from Camembert over Brie to Saint-Maur. Why is that so? First, let's think about what cheese really is. Here's my definition. If nature has its way, cheese is spoiled milk, just as grape juice turns into vinegar. If humans carefully guide that process of decay, the result can be something much more complex and better. Grown-up milk, so to say. However, as is the case in many areas, for instance, wine, if humans become too efficient at controlling, the result is stripped of character, individuality, beauty. You may blame it on the large numbers of German immigrants who came to the US during the 19th century and early 20s, but both countries have been excelling in engineering and thus controlling efficiency. The US are the world's largest cheese producer with almost 5 million tons in 2012. Germany is number 2 with almost 2.4 million tons, followed by France and Italy. The switch from very small scale production for self-sufficiency to extremely efficient large scale production happened very quickly due to industrialization and its fast progress in technology, urbanization, and better transport. So in contrast to rural, less densely populated France, with its many remote corners, but a common market in Paris, in North America and Germany, as well as the UK, industrialization turned cheese into a widely tradable commodity. To put this into a larger context, let's look a bit closer at the history of cheesemaking in Germany. As I mentioned earlier, recorded cheese history in Germany began with Tacitus, Lac concretum, curdled milk or quark or farmer's cheese, as opposed to Roman caseos, cheese, larger storable wheels made with rennet. We were barbarians. The Romans introduced us to the use of rennet in cheese making. But for the most part, farmers produced cheese only when they had a surplus of milk or when fresh milk and butter were not economically viable on the local market. Cattle were mostly kept as draught animals and for meat, and they were expensive to keep. Many farmers were forced to slaughter most of their cows each autumn for lack of feed. In short, there wasn't much milk to make cheese. Industrialization was to change that, but it brought other changes with it at the same time. Besides the technical progress, the Revolution of 1848 extended farmers' independence, and its subsequent agrarian revolution introduced more efficient systems of farming. At the same time, urbanization, new cooling technologies, and transport systems created new markets. Workers flocked to the cities, and rural labor became scarce and expensive. Also, cheap grain imports from the United States caused the prices to collapse. Farmers, therefore, switched from labor-intensive crops to more productive and financially lucrative pastures. Cattle breeding was intensified to achieve higher yields of both meat and milk, and feeding regimes were optimized. The transition from domestic self-sufficiency to an industrialized and commercialized dairy industry happened late compared to England, but extremely quickly, as agronomist and writer Josef von Schreibers predicted in this rather scary quote in 1847. The animal has to be turned into a machine destined to transform the given feed in the shortest time and in the least amount of space into the maximum amount of milk. So now there was milk. But despite all official efforts to promote fresh milk as a healthy alternative to beer and spirits, including distributing it for free, the working classes considered milk fit only for paupers who could not afford coffee or beer. Butter and cheese, however, were regarded as very desirable and luxurious products. So, with the economic boom after the Franco-German War of 1870-71, cheese consumption in Germany rose, and sour and skim milk cheeses were abandoned in favor of fattier ones. This might have been the moment, the historic moment, for a true artisanal cheese scene to develop in Germany. But they were the engineers with their machines. By the end of the 19th century, cheesemaking in Germany had become quite industrialized, part of the anonymous world of standardized commodities. Then, the First World War's disastrous misplanning led to the state controlling food production and distribution. Cheese, like all other food products, came under government regulations, which of course emphasized safe supplies for everyone instead of luxury and fine taste for the few. The Reichsmilchgesetz, the German dairy law of 1932, further controlled both production and rationing. This trend continued after the Second World War through the 1950 Bewirtschaftungsnotgesetz, an emergency law enacted to regulate the production, distribution, and pricing of milk and fat, which remained in effect until 1969. When I was growing up in the 1960s, German cheese was plentiful, but mostly plain and affordable. Imported cheeses from places like France were considered a luxury for connoisseurs. From the end of the 1970s until the creation of the European Community in 1992, worries about shortages turned into anxiety about overproduction. Milchsee, Milk Lake, and Butterberg, Butter Mountain, the colloquial terms for stockpiled dairy products, grew. In 1984, milk quota with severe financial sanctions on overproduction were introduced. Combined with falling milk prices, the system created a vicious circle of ever-growing but ever less profitable dairy farms that had to pay high prices to obtain additional quotas in order to survive. The quota system was finally abolished in April 2015. I think it is nothing short of a miracle that the spirit of independent farmers' responsibility for their own products survived in some small pockets during all that. What do I mean by that? I mean the opposite of how most conventional farmers in the Western world work and live today. Utterly dependent on all kinds of industries to provide all the stuff you throw out on the field, spray your crops with, treat your animals with, as well as the big dairy truck that reliably collects your milk, the meat company who takes care of the young male calves and some female ones too, etc., etc. One important reason some farmers did remember how to stand on their own feet was the Lebensreform or life reform movement that developed as a countertrend to Germany's rapid urbanization and industrialization from the 1860s on. Its principles could be summarized by the slogan, "Back to the purity of nature." Vegetarianism and temperance, or even abstinence from coffee, tobacco, and/or alcohol, with the promotion of milk as an alternative, were the movement's most obvious features. And I'm not saying, don't get me wrong, that all the features are good things. Because anti-vaccination clubs, the idealization of raw food, nudism, scout and hiking clubs were amongst its many other facets. Reform houses selling reformed whole foods sprang up, mostly in major cities where they still exist. And I think it sounds amazingly familiar when you think about what's been happening in the 1970s and 80s and what we're seeing today. Whole food in particular gained a new dimension when Rudolf Steiner and the anthroposophical philosopher discussed the precepts of biodynamic agriculture in his Landwirtschaftlicher Kurs, a 1924 lecture to landowners in the then Silesian town of Kobernitz near Breslau. Following from this always throws me, I'm sorry, from anthroposophy's holistic approach to life, Steiner placed agriculture into a much larger cosmic context, emphasizing the independent, self-sufficient structure of farms. As an alternative to the new industrial fertilizers and chemicals, he recommended natural preparations made from mineral, herbal, and animal components, as well as the use of cow dung to stimulate soil fertility and to avoid pests and diseases. He considered seeds the condensed recollection of a farm, but he also stressed the fact that these principles needed to be translated afresh to every respective location and situation, reinvented every single time. So in fact, what he was pointing at is that you have to look to where you are and what is going on there. You have to look at the soil and take it all in instead of applying, just throwing out something from your tractor. Steiner was convinced that spiritual powers enable life on Earth, that Earth, cosmos, and human beings all work together to influence plant growth, what is also called chronobiology. Anthroposophists see a correlation between taste and morphological features. For them, human taste is an essential element for detecting the intrinsic quality of foods and understanding the connections among production methods, geographic location, and varietal characteristics. It is mainly on the organic and biodynamic farms that the new cheese culture of Germany has its roots. As I said earlier on, there are really only two areas in Germany with a cheese tradition, in the very north and in the mountains in the south, on the border with Switzerland and Austria in the Allgäu. For the rest of Germany, much like in North America, cheesemakers are completely free and unbound. Whereas, for instance, in France, when on the Loire and working with goat milk, you will probably make Crottin or Saint-Maur or any of the many traditional cheeses. And we're seeing a lot of new cheeses in Germany. For the first time in German history, a distinctive cheese landscape can be found in small dairies throughout the country. And coming back to my point about Germans' openness to innovation, even right in the center of the Allgäu traditions in the south, new cheeses are being created. To name just one example, Arturo Chiriboga is an Ecuadorian who established a creamery in Bad Hindelang. And He has now moved to another place in the Allgäu, but the star of his cheese collection continues to be Chiriboga Blue, his take on Bavarian Blue. And you can actually find this cheese also in the US and in the UK. For a long time, we didn't get any of it here in Germany because all of it was exported. And at the same time, traditional ways of cheese making are newly appreciated and protected, actively protected against the engineers' yearning for efficiency. Properly aged cheese, and I mean, growing up needs time, as we all know, are finding a market once again. One of my favorites and highlights is Alpeloch, made using mostly wooden implements, the dairy's own cultures, and rennet made from their own calves. And as you can, I mean, I could now go on and on and on. And if we could now proceed to tasting some of those cheeses together, which I hope we will at one point in the future, I'd be pouring dry Riesling with the Alpine cheese. Riesling is the white grape that arguably translates the German landscape best in the glass. And contrary to popular perception, it is not always sweet. This might be an unfamiliar or unexpected pairing for most of you, but be open always to the new. Thank you. And instead of a cheese and a glass of wine, I have to offer you something different, and that is a cheese playlist, which my friend and co-fellow trustee David Matchett put together. And I'll put that in the chat for you. Let me get this right so that it goes to everybody. And here you go. It's you just have to click on it, and then you find a link, and you can store away that link and explore later. With that, I'm very happy to take questions. What is the, oh, Peter is in the room. Hello, Peter. I didn't even see you. I didn't know that the culinary historians of Washington, D.C. Had all of you amongst them. That's a nice surprise. What is the ratio? Oh, go ahead, Peter.
I said I'm a freeloader.
What is the ratio of production? You mean
mass-produced cheese versus?
You mean how is the pyramid shaped? Well, that's a very good question, which I can't answer with any precision. It is very much a pyramid with a very large bottom, because we are exporting so much of that cheese, like, yeah. Are there any processed cheeses in Germany? You mean the
equivalent to, you know, like American cheese in America?
Of course there are. Of course there are. Remember, Kraft is a German name. Yes, I grew up with, we call them Schmelzkäse because they have those a certain kind of salt, as you know. And yeah, of course, sure. Bruce says, have any regions in Germany raised appreciable, whatever, however you pronounce it, numbers of sheep or goats? And yes, of course, because, you know, the first artisan cheeses were very much started by people who came to cheese making from some very different areas, and they were still quotas for cow's milk. And so it was very difficult. I mean, a cow is kind of, as Laura Chanel and all those ladies on the Californian coast found out, a cow is somehow not that practical. It's quite a big animal to handle, especially if you haven't been raised on a farm with cows. And so a lot of people first started with a few goats and a few sheep, and yes, there is a lot of stuff going on with that. Sandy grew up eating Liederkranz as a German cheese. Well, yes, and it was invented in the US. This is when does someone or something become American, and you could call it probably German American or something. It is rooted in the German cheese tradition, or Germanic, we should say, because of course there's Alsace and there's all the other areas. But yes, I also think that it was invented in the US. Margie asked, how old is the cheese tradition in the Allgäu? Does it go back beyond the mid to late 1800s? Absolutely. I would need to look up the exact date in my book, which I won't do now, but I think the first documentation of farms established on higher pastures during the summer, so of mountain dairies, so to say, goes back to at least the 13th century in the Allgäu. Because, yeah, we will not go into the details, because if I'm, it will be there a long time, but definitely, yes. And Margie, again, there are lots of sheep and goat. Yeah, okay, that answers that. Marlene says, are there any German frying cheese similar to the Middle Eastern halloumi? Well, now they are, because they are quite popular, and because we are also, I mean, in Germany, just as everywhere else, during the summer, everybody seems to abandon their stove and only be at the barbecue. And yes, frying cheese lends itself. So a lot of the new cheese producers also make this type of cheese. Karen says, can you put the name of that artisan cheese you mentioned in the chat? The one that's available? Yes, the Cherry Burger Blue, absolutely. Let me just make sure. And sometimes it is sold just as Bavarian Blue, because people find that it's a bit of a mouthful, either one or the other. I'm not sure which one is more of a mouthful. And it's a very, it's the most delicious thing. It's a bit like buttercream, like savory buttercream in a good way, because it's very rich, but at the same time it has a beautiful acidity that carries all that richness. And Arturo has devised a very, I mean, I think it just happened, as most cheeses are, well, nowadays they are invented sometimes. Of course, the industrial cheeses are invented and planned, but most cheeses, like the best dishes, just happen because the circumstances are the way they are, and somebody happens to do something and then finds out that it works. And that's what serendipity is all about, right? How is that different from Cambozola, Laurie asked. Well, Cambozola is a genius thing. It's an industrial cheese, but it comes from the Allgäu, and it's quite an old company behind it. And it's a genius thing because Cambozola was the first cheese that managed to have a white rind, bloomy rind cheese, like type Camembert or Brie, with blue mold inside. And it's really tricky to get this right, because blue mold tends to be much stronger than white mold. It overrides white mold. It tends to settle over the, like overpopulate the white mold. So Cambozola is more like a soft cheese, like a Camembert paste, whereas Chiriboga Blue is all creaminess. It's more like, like, let's say it's more like a cow's milk Roquefort, but it is not like Roquefort. I'm not saying it is like Roquefort, okay? But it's that size, and also the texture is more like that. David Matchett, oh no, he is Randy. We're about history. So to ask about the future is not fair. Well, the future is the history. Well, no, the different, anyhow. But without historic roots, will artisanal foods survive? Are they merely fads? I think that's, you know, when we think of tradition as innovation that proved useful, so stays around and becomes tradition, then it's the same with new foods. If they are liked and they're eaten and they're bought, then they will stay around. So some will, others won't. I think Chiré Blue has proven that. I mean, it remains to be seen, because so far it's one producer making it. It's his recipe, his way of doing things. And if he stops doing it, then perhaps somebody else will take over. I think things change all the time, but I don't think of them as fads. David is asking, are any of the new producers bringing in styles or techniques from non-European countries of origin, new German cheeses? Yes, we mentioned already frying cheese, which definitely is not a German or a European tradition as such, or, well, it's on the margin. It's Cyprus, so I don't know. We are seeing right now quite a wave of Syrian type cheeses, so more like that area. I'm a bit at a loss what you might be thinking of, because non-European cheeses.
I was actually considering the Syrian, you know, the Syrian cheese making as a fantastic culture in its own right, and also the techniques that would be coming in that may not be, you know, more suited to a warmer climate rather than a cooler climate, and how that would actually impact on cheeses that would be made in, you know, when people are coming in, how they bring their techniques.
They're certainly bringing their cheese techniques with them, and we are seeing that. Yes, the answer is yes. Yes, Karen, you should have shopped for special cheeses before this meeting, but you can do so afterwards. Syrian type cheeses like labneh, cheeses from Syria. Yeah. Turkish cheeses. Oh, Margie, you're reading my mind. Well, this is a really interesting question, because, of course, especially in Berlin, the Turkish community is immense. It's the largest community, but it's always, yeah. But I apologize for the but it's not. You know, it took a very, very long time for Germany to wrap its mind around the fact that we might be an immigration country. It took until, I would say, 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, there was this book published by Doug Sanders, A Rival City. Highly recommended. He discusses, he's a Canadian journalist, and he discusses cities as places. A true big city is a place which offers a point of entrance on all kinds of levels. So no matter if you speak the language or not, whatever your skills are, somehow you find your way into your new place. And he analyzes, so it might be that you first settle down in a slum and you first have to, you know, work your way up, but somehow you can make it into that new culture. And he analyzes some cities around the world, including Berlin. And as I said, this was 10 years ago, and Berlin doesn't really fare that well with him, because he says, look at all those Turkish people who never really integrated, who never really became gradually at least Turkish German, as you would say, well, I might think of Italo-Americans or African-Americans or whatever. And of course he is right, but at the same time, it's a bit of a different situation, because as I'm sure most of you know, the Turkish community came here not because they wanted to leave Turkey and start a new life in Germany, but because during the I think it started in the 1950s, but it really gained momentum in the 1960s, that there was a labor shortage due to the economic boom, post-war boom, and so there was a state program inviting guest workers from poorer nations, mainly around the Mediterranean. And the idea was for mainly young male to come for a limited amount of years to Germany to work and then go back home again. All fine and good, except that the companies found that they didn't want to send back workers who had just acquired some skills after 3 or 5 years. So they were allowed to settle down, to stay longer. Then they wanted their families to come, to start families. And so there was this large Turkish community building up, who weren't really neither here nor there. And that makes for all this. And I think since then we've come a long way. And we now see second generation, especially in the Turkish community, who think of themselves like really like Germans and Turkish, but in a positive way, and who regard Germany as their home. And sorry, long loop, coming back to the cheese. There is a lot of Turkish style cheese produced in Germany. Those kind of what we tend to think of as feta types, which is white cheese in Turkish. But they're all made here using mostly pasteurized cow's milk. Whereas the traditional Anatolian cheeses, which are like really a thing of immense fascination for me, are mostly, of course, made of sheep's and some goat's milk. And they go back, they have traditional forms which go back, which connect us to the beginning of our civilization, where you can read, it's living history, those cheeses. You can't produce that here in Germany, and you can't, I don't know of any cheesemaker who does that, really, like the not the simple stuff, but the more elaborate stuff of Turkish cheeses. And unfortunately, because it's not part of the EU, they have great difficulties and basically are not allowed to import any Turkish cheeses. I'm bringing, when we still used to travel, my trolley case always is very aromatic. So sometimes for those cheese tastings, and you can read about that on my blog, which is called Heinzelmann Cheese. you can, so we taste some of those cheeses. Yes, Peter, you're absolutely right. But first, you need to want to integrate, yeah, it's a bit of a tricky thing. Are most of the artisan cheese made there from cow? Is this Karen? Is this regarding, you're saying, are most of the artisan cheese made there from cow? Are you talking about Turkey or Germany?
Germany, actually, because I wrote it a few minutes before you started talking about Turkey. But I'm just curious as to how popular goats are and sheep are, you know, on farms, and is it still vastly majority cow?
No. For the artisan cheese and the new cheese movement, it's actually the opposite. It's mostly, I would think it's at least, I don't have the exact numbers, but I would say it's at least as much goat and sheep as it is cow. Because initially, as I said before, earlier on, for when you start cheese making and keeping animals, most people consider it easier to handle goats or sheep. Also the quota for cow's milk only came down in 2015. Before that, you had to have a quota to have cow's milk. So
okay.
And yes, Poland and Bulgaria, I mean, all over, there is wonderful cheese.
Yes, thank you so much. Wonderful talk.
Well, thank you. Okay, it seems to go quiet on the question front. So Margie, I think back to you. Ooh, whoever is now.
I'll jump in here and thank you very much. Ursula is fascinating, and I particularly enjoyed the way you went through the history of Germany in terms of how the different kinds of cheese have evolved. I found that particularly interesting.
Thank you. And as I said, you'll find me, I think I put my blog or website here in the chat. And there's also, you can contact me there, any questions, any further remarks. I'm happy to hear from any of you.
It's very fascinating. And I do wish we could have done this and had tastings. That would have been lovely.
Okay, Ursula, let me ask a nuts and bolts question I neglected to ask you yesterday, and that is, do you mind if we post the recording of this on a limited YouTube site?
Of course, no problem.
Thank you.
I hope I didn't have any tomato on my or whatever.
I have
No,
Photoshop.
sure.
Margie, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I can put Ursula's blog site and all of that in the newsletter.
Okay, great idea.
Oh, and here's the last question from Karen. If I lead cheese tours, well, I do all kinds of things. And if you have something in mind, just be in touch and we can discuss whatever, you know. I'm up for, no, I shouldn't say almost anything, but yes, I am. Margie knows. All right.
Well, thank you again so much. We're going to continue the meeting with the business part. You're welcome to hang around, or you're welcome to.
If you don't mind, because you know it's 9 o'clock this end and I haven't had dinner and no wine yet, because I don't trust myself to give a talk with wine in my veins. So if you don't mind, then I will leave you to your business and hope that I meet at least some of you in person at some point. with cheese and wine in hand.